what should happen to criminals than most of the people in this room. Oh, but maybe 20% of the people in this room might actually secretly agree with Bild. But in Germany, you're sort of not allowed to come out and say, I think Anders Breivik should be strung up on the next tree. Even though I personally, subjectively, I think he should be strung up on the next tree. I think he deserves to die, metaphysically. As an abstract proposition, he's about the guiltiest criminal ever. The only thing is, I don't agree that the state has the right to kill him. I don't think that, well, I just don't trust the state enough to do that. And of course, the thing is, it's really hard in the Breivik case because his crime was so heinous, and he's a very strange person, but I don't necessarily think he's insane. I think he knew exactly what he was doing. But if you talk to him, there's been a lot of documentaries about Norway and Norwegians, and you find a lot of Norwegians, as in any democratic society, who say, I think his treatment is much too lenient, and maybe we should even have the death penalty for him. So there's certainly that component in Norwegian society. But there's a surprising number of Norwegian, man-in-the-street interviews with ordinary people, and who agree with the premier, Jens Stoltenberg, who said that this is a case that tests the humane principles of our criminal justice system and the Christian basis of our society, not in the sense that we have an official church and that everyone believes in the same God and principles, but with the basic principles of thou shalt not return evil for evil and turn the other cheek. And even when someone has caused enormous pain and suffering and harm, we are going to incapacitate him and make sure he never does anything like this again, but we are not going to sink to his level. We are going to treat him far better than he treated his victims, because that is a principle that drives and motivates us, a principle of respect for human dignity. We're protecting his human dignity not for his sake, but for our sake. We are treating him better than he deserves to be treated because of what it says about us as a society and what it says about our aspirations and what it says about our ability to overcome these natural and completely understandable feelings of vengeance and hatred. And not every Norwegian agrees with that, but according to polls, a significant number of them, do not want to see the law changed so that he can get a much harsher penalty, which of course would also be illegal. I mean, to me, it's this simple case of sticking to principles. If you have principles by which your society operates, then they are going to be tested by cases like Anders Breivik, and that is where, as we say in America, the rubber hits the road. That is where it gets difficult to stick to your principles. Just as if you're tempted to torture somebody because they probably really do have information that would save lives, like the Daschner fall. Well, Daschner was punished. Not very strictly, but the court said torture is unacceptable under all circumstances. Nothing ever justifies it. That is a fundamental bedrock principle of our society. And so I see the Breivik case, and there's also a sense in which cultural factors are important. Because why do a large number of Norwegians accept the fact that Breivik will go to a relatively luxurious prison life for only 21 years? Because they have been participating in a culture and a national discourse and a way of talking about humanity and punishment that has reduced their instinct for violent retribution or for cruel punishment of prisoners. And I think that is basically, I will say that I think that is a sign of cultural advancement. I think that's the sign of growth and maturing of a culture. I'm not afraid to come out and put it that particular way. And so I look at the Breivik case, and although I have nothing but contempt for him and feel horror and disgust at what he does, I'm actually sort of proud of the fact that Norway has stayed its hand and is treating him just as any other murderer. That's my rebuttal.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I'd like to dwell on one point that Andrew just made and that drew some applause. I know that you, Robert, have written repeatedly that sometimes some people deserve to die and we have a duty to kill them. I'm not entirely sure that from the first part of this sentence, some people deserve to die, which some people may agree with. The second part necessarily follows, and I think this was implicit in what Andrew was just saying. How do we get from some people deserve to hurt because what they did is so despicable, to we have a punishment to make them feel that, we have a duty to make them feel that pain, and the state is the right instrument to inflict it?
Well, I'm not afraid of discussing the death penalty, but I do think it is odd that here we are again when we said we weren't going to focus on it, but that's okay. There are, since we're here for the moment, abolitionists, that is those who oppose the death penalty, are divided, can be divided usefully, it seems to me, into two camps. There are some who think that no one ever deserves to die, that the notion of deserving to die is internally incoherent, because death and desert can never be put in the same sentence. Then there are others, like Andrew, if I understood his statement, and your question regarding it, there are others who acknowledge that people can deserve to die as a matter of a moral principle. They can commit acts and cause harms that are so heinous and despicable with an attitude that is so terrible that if they happen to be walking down the street and a meteor should fall on their heads, and it was cosmic justice, literally, we might say that it was poetic justice. But though it's fine, and it would be okay for us to be pleased that they had finally gotten their just desert as soon as possible, it's never for the system of justice to do it. It's not for the state ever to do it. It's not for the people ever to do it. Now, of course, the German reaction to that is an embrace that it is not the state to do it, is perfectly understandable historically, as Andrew points out in his book, and as you all know. The criminal justice system was a perversion under the Nazi regime. 30,000 people were sentenced to death. That's not even counting the millions who were killed under a supposed cover of law in the concentration camps and the death camps. And a society that was desperately eager to cleanly break from that past. And part of that past was the articulated premise that retribution was legitimate, broke cleanly from it in a way that rejected and renounced the right of the state ever to execute. But the state are the people, and the state is a surrogate for the people. And to answer your question now directly with that as the background, the state says, the people say, that through the instrument of government, we are going to restrain our individual passion for revenge, even when it's appropriate, and instead we're going to transfer that to the community at large. Now, retribution is not revenge. They come from a common wellspring, which is the desire to inflict pain on those who inflicted pain on us. But retribution, unlike revenge, is limited and proportional. And retribution, unlike revenge, is appropriately part of the community's response. Revenge is not. Retribution is. So the simple answer to the very deep question of what gives us the responsibility is just one step beyond the answer of what gives us the right. What gives us, the people, the right to kill collectively sometimes, and rarely, let me emphasize very rarely, but sometimes, in the name of the people. What gives us that right is that we surrendered it as a matter of revenge as individuals in order to resume it as a matter of retribution as a collective.
Would you like to react?
Yes, I actually kind of agree with that. But I suppose what I would say is, we give the state the right to enact punishment in our names, but the state can never actually get it right. I mean, the state is never going to be able to precisely determine the exact level of guilt that a particular offender possesses and to inflict the exact amount of pain. In my view, the state basically has lots of drawbacks and lots of flaws. It is composed of institutions run by fallible human beings. I mean, I'm in favor of a generous social welfare system, and I pay my taxes here in Germany. But the thing is, the state is not really doing anything extremely critical when it decides how much welfare benefits somebody could get. I mean, that is not a life or death decision, or that is not a decision that can permanently warp and destroy a human life. But when the state makes a decision about whether somebody is going to go to prison for several years, that is a decision in which a human future is at stake, in which a human being could be severely damaged in their ability to live out their lives and to achieve what they want and to realize themselves. And there, I think, and of course in the United States, the state makes the decision whether people are going to die or not. And I simply don't trust the state in this particular context to get it right. I think the state constantly makes mistakes. And if I accept that the state constantly makes mistakes, I would rather make sure the state erred on the side of humanity rather than on the side of inflicting pain and punishment. The old principle that also Friedrich the Great said was it is better to let 10 guilty persons go free than to punish one innocent person. And that's also a saying in the American criminal and the common law criminal justice system. And I think that is basically a humane instinct. And so I would certainly accept the accusation that Germany, from a retributive perspective, underpunishes people, that it does not give them their just deserts. And I think to myself, I can live with that, because I would rather a system in which the state mistakenly and inaccurately gives people less punishment than they deserve than in which the state routinely, inaccurately gives people more punishment than they deserve. I think that principle is one, so I'm okay with the fact that the public's will for revenge, or retribution also, probably is not fully accurately realized in the German criminal justice system. And we know this because Germans themselves, by large majorities, say that they believe the German criminal justice system is too lenient. And I can understand why they think that. You know, not all of us in this room, most of us in this room probably don't think that way, but everybody on the street thinks it. About 65 to 70% of Germans think their criminal justice system is too lenient. I think that's a problem. It's a problem of democratic legitimacy. It's not an ideal state. But the thing is, I'm willing to live with it. I'm willing to say that the reason the criminal justice system doesn't adequately capture the public's will to revenge or retribution is because it's running on principles that require it to err on the side of humanity. And I'm willing to accept that inaccuracy because I simply think, in the grand scheme of things, that democratic deficit, that failure to reflect the will of the people, is actually an acceptable and appropriate thing, an acceptable and appropriate price to pay for having a humane criminal justice system.
Well, I'd never want to cut off applause for my opponent, but we're not opponents, and I want to restate common ground here, because there is substantial common ground. If we have to err, we should err on the side of innocence, we should err on the side of human dignity, which is why, in my view, our very harshest punishments, such as the death penalty, or even life without parole, should require a different burden of persuasion attaching to them, a higher burden of persuasion than ordinary punishments, than other punishments. In my view, it's not enough for the jury, or in the case of a system that has no jury and it's a judge, it's not enough for the judge to be convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant is guilty. That's the guilt phase. That's the rational, strictly rational part of that. Emotion shouldn't enter into it. In my opinion, when it comes time for the death penalty or life without parole, where you are absolutely committing yourself to never releasing this person, either you will kill him or he will die in prison, and no revisiting it 20 years down the road. That's what strictly life without parole is. Before you're able to give out that kind of sentence, my view is first that you must not have even a residual doubt as to his guilt. That is, a doubt for which you cannot give a reason. It is not strictly rational, but it's real. Something in your gut just wonders he might just be innocent. My view is you should not be able to get the death penalty or life without parole if the jury or judge has even a residual doubt. And then finally, it's not enough that they have even just a residual doubt. They have to be convinced not only beyond any residual doubts that he did it, they should have to be convinced to a moral certainty that he deserves it. That moral certainty is more than mere rationality. That moral certainty brings within it an emotional component. And I'm happy to hear the concession of underpunishment. And there's just one more thing I would like to mention now, which I hope will open up some more discussion. When you talk about underpunishment, Andrew, you talk about in large part, in terms of the length of the sentence, 21 years for Breivik. The German Prison Act of 1976 has another concept written into it, and I quote Section 3, Subdivision 1. Life in penal institutions should be approximated as far as possible to general living conditions in the outside world. In other words, let's be clear what this act says and what the mission statement is that's supposed to guide the Department of Corrections. They are supposed to maintain prisons such that, except for the loss of freedom to go outside the walls, ideally, consistent with safety inside, your day-to-day life is to as nearly resemble what your life would be if you were outside being unpunished and free. And I am certain, as a human being who happens to be a retributivist, that somebody who murders children should not have a life thereafter, day to day, that resembles as nearly as possible, consistent with safety, the life that he would be leading were he a totally blameless and free person. I urge you to focus in part, when you concede under punishment, not only in the length of sentence, how long, but the quality of life lived for those who are supposedly undergoing punishment.
But actually, could I just follow up and say, sure, what would your idea of a more appropriate prison regime be?
Fair question. For someone like Breivik, for someone who kidnaps a child, a lawyer who kidnapped, you all know where I'm heading, a lawyer who kidnaps a child of wealthy parents for ransom in order to maintain his apparent successful lifestyle, attaching to an apparently successful law career, passes the ransom note, gets €1 million, only he's killed the child anyway. For somebody like that, if he is spared the death penalty and instead given life in prison, not only in terms of the duration, he should never be released, I don't care who he becomes, but you ask, what should the quality of his life be? Well, for example, the food that he eats, it shouldn't be tasty. I'm serious. He should be fed Nutriloaf. Now, Nutriloaf, for those of you who haven't had the joy of experiencing it, Nutriloaf is a tasteless, nutritionally complete patty. It's just this ugly looking thing that looks like a hamburger, and when you taste it, it's tasteless. It's got nothing, no satisfaction, no pleasure, but it doesn't kill you. No surreptitious death penalty claiming it's only life without parole. It doesn't foreshorten your life. In fact, it might actually extend your life, because if you don't eat potato chips and other fine foods like that tend to promote heart disease, ironically, you might actually extend your life through it. But the point is, he should not experience pleasure. He should not have color televisions he shouldn't have color television at all, flat screen TV. In the prison we visited last time, which does not house, yesterday, it does not house convicted murderers. But I inquired and was told that it's relevantly similar to the prison in Mannheim, which does. There's flat screen TVs. There's CD players. You shouldn't be watching first-run movies, listening to your favorite music, watching your favorite television programs, which also often will be CSI, even here in Germany. This is not the kind of life that you are entitled to. This is not justice. This is not staying connected to the 11-year-old boy who you kidnapped and killed. I mean, that only begins it. I could go on, but you get the sense. It's not that we're torturing you and physically abusing you, but we're certainly not giving you privileges and pleasures. You should never have a contact visit, never be able to touch another human being, ever, ever again. Never have the pleasures, the joys of food, of clothing, of all the associated joys on the outside world. Life should be self-consciously punitive forever. It should be unpleasant.
Let me jump in here. I'm sure that that most of you have noticed that Professor Blecker was talking about the case of Magnus Gejun, who killed Jacob von Metzler, the son of a wealthy Frankfurt banker. And this case has made a lot of headlines, and I'd like to ask Andrew what he would consider appropriate punishment in this case. How much longer should we keep Magnus Gejun in prison? He has, at least that's what he says, converted to Christianity by now. He's written a book that's titled Alone with God, if I'm not completely mistaken, and he's showing utter remorse at what he has done. So if we believe that his statements are accurate and truthful, we should assume that he's been almost fully rehabilitated already. So in your view, what would be appropriate punishment for him, and how much longer should we be keeping him?
Now, he got a life sentence, right? Lebenslänglich.
Yes.
And did he get a besondere schwere Schuld?
I think so, yes.
Okay, so he's in prison for 25 years. There will be a mandatory presumption that he should be released from prison after 25 years. That's what a life sentence actually means. Actually, that's what a special life sentence for a particularly grave crime means in Germany. And I would say I'm okay with that. That strikes me as a reasonable punishment for his disgusting and vicious greed-motivated crime. And the fact that he has turned to God and apparently written a book about it. Now, of course, there's a cliche that many prisoners turn to God and convert to some sort of religion in order to try to improve their public image or get a chance at an early release. That certainly happens sometimes, but I think it's just as common for prisoners who are segregated from the outside world and, at least in terms of routine contact with the people they used to hang out with, and they now have a lot more time on their hands. They begin to think about what they did and what motivated them, and they have access to reading materials and time to think about them and spiritual counseling. And I've met many prisoners who I believe have made an entirely sincere transformation of their personality, and sometimes I was able to get a couple people off death row and they went back to live in the community, and I've kept up with them, and the ones who made this transformation have continued to lead relatively responsible lives. I mean, they might have gone back to drinking a bit after they got out of death row, but they gained insight into their crime and to what drove them to commit it, and they changed their lives through a sincere religious transformation or other kind of personal transformation. And to me, that when that happens, it doesn't always happen. I mean, I want to keep in the real world here and acknowledge that lots of people do not correct themselves and, remain, very, very unpleasant human beings. But there are those who change and transform themselves. And when they get out of prison after finishing their sentence, to me, that is a complete and utter victory for society. Because that is, instead of adding to the amount of violence in society by killing that person, or inflicting extreme punishment on them, society has actually reduced the amount of violence that is happening in society and has provided an opportunity to reclaim a human being and bring them back into the fold of people who act conscientiously and care about other people. That does occasionally happen, and to me, that is the ideal case. That is actually exactly what a criminal justice system should aspire to. And so if Gifgen has transformed himself, I would still think that he should serve out his sentence of 25 years. And in many cases, there are many prisoners who might themselves also agree with that. If they show remorse and understand the gravity of what they did, they may well accept that they need to be punished and that they will have to have a large section of their life taken away. But then after that, he will have a chance at rejoining society. And to me, if him coming back into society and leading a productive life, telling other people and warning them about the corruption and depravity that he fell victim to, trying to warn them away and make sure they don't fall into the same trap and commit the same evil he did, is a win-win situation and is an example of the system working at its best. Not that it always happens that way, but when it does, I personally see that as the optimal result.
I'm sorry. You're all, of course, welcome to applaud. Andrew, if anyone is moved to applaud me, you can skip it so we'll have more time to discuss.
Don't applaud me either.
Just very briefly, a couple of responses and reactions to that. We hear about remorse, and this comes from somebody, I've spent several thousand hours in ideal conditions, deeply in conversation with convicted killers over 25 years in 15 prisons in 7 states. As a sample goes, it's about as large as you're likely to get for any study. I've come to understand that there's an enormous difference between remorse and regret. Almost always, well into a life sentence, the convicted killer feels regret. That is, he comes to understand his own life as wasted, since he's spending it in prison. He comes to understand and very deeply regret what the effect of his imprisonment is having on his family, who have to watch him spend his life in prison. That's regret. That's different from remorse. Very few of them, actually. It's not unheard of, but it's relatively rare. And it can easily be faked and it can never be forced. But we have to be very careful because our appropriate reaction to regret is not the same as our appropriate reaction to remorse. Now, in terms of turning to God and the legitimacy of that, I mean, I don't know deeply enough, I don't understand German society, so I don't know the degree to which you are committed to a separation of church and state. But at least in the United States, we are committed to a separation of church and state. Whatever his deal is with God, and however much God or little God may forgive him, that's whatever fate awaits him after he dies. But while he's here, what we have as a responsibility is justice. Justice in this world as if that's all there is. You can come out any way you want on the afterlife and on what his attitude towards God will bring him later. But that's not our concern, rightfully, in this world. Just one quick anecdote. Inside the prison, I would ask the guys, these convicted murderers, some of whom were extraordinarily vicious, do you believe in heaven or hell? And typically they would say, not universally, but typically they'd say yes. And I'd say, and where do you think you're going? And several of them said, heaven. And I remember one particular one who said that. And I said, oh, that's curious. I mean, here you just detailed to me how you killed 6 people and in really bloody set of circumstances, and you're going to heaven. I'm curious, how are you getting there? And his response to me was, oh, well, you see, I learned in church that as long as you embrace God, even a moment before you die, as long as you embrace God, then you go to heaven regardless of what deeds you have committed, because God is forgiving. His theology may or may not be correct. His relationship to God may or may not be true, but ironically and perversely, it enabled him to continue in his vicious ways, figuring, as he told me, that one day he'd be lying in a pool of blood, and at that moment he would embrace God and then go to heaven.
I would like to ask both of you about a particular point that seems to me is very important to the difference in your opinion, and that is the role that emotion should play in the law. Robert Blecker is actively appealing to your emotion, not in a manipulative or sneaky way. He's doing it very explicitly. And if I understand Andrew Hammel correctly, he's very skeptical about letting emotion run wild when speaking about criminal justice. Could you please tell us what the appropriate role of emotion is when thinking about crime and punishment?
Emotion is absolutely central to a moral response. Adam Smith, of course, famous for The Wealth of Nations, the ultimate capitalist treatise, was actually more famous in his lifetime for a book called A Theory of Moral Sentiments, which he published 17 years earlier, and justly famous. It's the ultimate retributive book of a psychological account. And what Adam Smith says in that work, which I think is fundamentally correct, is that at base, every moral question is an emotional question. Every moral question. Now, it doesn't mean untethered emotion, raw emotion, but, and even abolitionists, those who are opposed to the death penalty, are increasingly understanding that the moral faculty is appropriately and deeply informed by the emotional faculty. So that once again, in terms especially of our worst punishments for our worst criminals, we cannot ultimately determine what the correct proportionality is as a matter of simple abstract reason. Reason plays a deep role in it. Reason is a limiting principle. But when I say I feel certain that some people deserve these punishments, that's a very self-consciously chosen phrase, feel certain. It's composed in part of the certainty that is rational and of the feeling that is emotional, which is not strictly rational. That doesn't mean it's irrational, but it's not rational, but it is, however, real. So the short answer to it is, for any system of justice that requires proportional punishment, in order to determine the nature of that punishment and the proportionality, some part of the moral faculty, some crucial part, must draw upon our emotions as an appropriate lens when combined adequately with reason, informed emotion.
And there we're probably definitely going to disagree, but before I disagree, I want to come back to the point about the guy who murdered 6 people and thought he would, be able to come to Jesus on his deathbed, and reminded me of an old joke by Francois Mitterrand. Somebody asked him, well, Mr. Mitterrand, what are your religious beliefs? And Mitterrand said, well, I was born a Catholic, and I shall surely die a Catholic, but in between? And there's also a very big distinction between regret and remorse. I would also endorse that. And remorse is something that there is no, one day we may be able to have a brain scan to determine whether it's accurate. And also we're developing brain scans that are getting better and better at identifying people with violent tendencies. And so I think neurological science is going to begin changing a lot of the ways we look at guilt and retribution, but I don't want to open that can of worms quite yet. But maybe we'll do that later. But I wanted to respond to the point about emotion. To me, it seems that emotion is inevitably going to be a part of especially the sentencing proceeding in any violent case of violent crime or any case of crime. And there's no way to completely eliminate it. And I think it shouldn't be completely eliminated because it's part of the retributive calculus. But I think it's very, very dangerous. I think it easily leads to arbitrariness. And I think one thing that to understand my concerns about it, you also have to remember that in criminal trials in the United States, a jury makes the decision about whether the defendant is guilty, and a jury makes the decision about what the defendant's penalty will be. Not always, but in many states, a jury makes both of those decisions. And what you see is that juries are, here's a classic example, is do you show juries large, blown-up color photographs of the crime scene? So there's a horrible crime involving a slashing murder. There is blood spattered all over the walls and ceilings and floors. The victims have been horribly mutilated. And if you can do enormous numbers of studies about this, and it's been proven beyond any doubt whatsoever, that the punishment the jury assigns for that crime can be overwhelmingly determined by how large that photo was, or whether they get to see the photo at all. And so a jury for exactly the same crime, everything else being completely equal, if they don't get to see those horrifying bloody photos of things they've never seen before, they will give the defendant one sentence. If they see a small black and white photo, they will give the defendant a double that sentence. And if they see a large color photo, they will give the defendant 4 times their first sentencing choice. And also you get the exact same effect with the testimony of victims. In many trials in the United States, the crime victims are allowed to come onto the witness stand and talk about exactly how the defendant's crime impacted them. And they get emotional, they cry, the jurors cry. And so whenever there's a certain extremely emotional testimony, they will hand out boxes of tissues to the jurors because it's quite predictable that all the female and half the male jurors will begin crying. And they will also become ill, and sometimes the trial has to be stopped if the crime scene videotape or photo is too gruesome. And so in that case, I think that it's unacceptable to have that level of arbitrariness, because there are certain, especially with violent crimes, especially with crimes against children, the emotion can totally overwhelm the criminal justice system's attempts to channel it. There's a saying among lawyers, you can't unring that bell. The judge will tell the jurors that the crime scene photographs are only evidence, and the jurors should not take them into account when they assess the defendant's penalties. But the jurors definitely do. Human psychology says it is inevitable. And then the question is that an acceptable margin of error? Can we accept the fact that a defendant got an extra 20 years on their sentence solely because the jurors saw a large blown-up photograph? And I think that that is a definite weakness in the justice system. Now, the way Germany resolves this question is by, of course you have to add footnotes, and I'm making absolute claims that aren't really true. But in most cases, judges determine the defendant's guilt and sentence. And the judges have seen these crime photos. They understand how ugly and horrifying they are, and the judges have a context and a framework of experience and an expectation that they will rationally reach a result about that particular crime, which means that you actually see much more consistent results in German criminal trials. Similar crimes really and actually do get very similar punishments. And so I think their emotion cannot be removed from the equation, but I see excessive emotionalism in the courtroom as a danger, because I simply don't think there are certain kinds of emotions raised by certain kinds of crimes that are so strong that they will overwhelm any attempt to channel them. And so that's why I think although they are understandable and I have sympathy for the victims, and I've seen those crime scene photos myself, I think that they need to be kept away, that excessive emotionalism needs to be kept away from the decision maker, because they're not making a decision to satisfy the victim of the crime. They are making a decision in the name of the state to give the appropriate sentence. And I think emotion can very often get in the way, and so I'm very distrustful of its role in especially assessing the sentence.
Gentlemen, I think you have made clear your fundamental differences, also found some common ground, which is a good thing. I think this might be a good time to throw it open to the audience and hear some questions. Do we have a microphone? Oh yeah, wonderful, we actually have 2. Probably unfair because so many hands shot up at the same time, so I'll just arbitrarily start in this corner.
Good heavens. All right.
Okay. Would you please stand up when asking your questions so the camera can catch you?
I have 2 questions, one for Robert Blecker, the other one for Andrew Hammel. For Robert Blecker, if we are all, as psychology and sociology say, influenced by society and educated through everyone around us, how can we determine which responsibility one person, how much responsibility one person has for what they do, and how much responsibility the society might have for what this person does? And so how do we determine that, and how can we execute the appropriate decision there? And then for Andrew Hammel, if we found ways for the state to determine perfectly or a lot better when a death penalty really is deserved, would it be right to execute it?
Thanks very much for the question. Just one last thing. Please, let's not make this so much about the death penalty as a very special case, but try to focus on the purpose of punishment per se. But of course, I'll let both of them answer.
Well, the question you ask me, of course, does not, I mean, it goes generally to the question of punishment. It goes to the heart of the question. It is the right question, which is, to what degree are we responsible? And Andrew mentioned neuroimaging and brain science. And so there's one part of us as sophisticated, scientific, modern, educated people that recognizes that people are biologically and genetically, some people predisposed to violence, that they are psychologically formed or deformed through abuse, by abuse, at an age when they are not yet at all responsible. I mean, no one could have spent the thousands of hours that I've spent inside a prison interviewing convicted killers, rapists, robbers, etc., and failed to be exposed to life stories of intense and serious abuse that made these people, that hardened them. And then, of course, you're exposed to social environments and social structures that will tend to promote crime. So from one perspective, from a strictly scientific perspective, of course, the end point of that is to suggest that we are all caused to do what we do, and that punishment is merely a function of our present ignorance. That once we get more sophisticated, we will understand why every criminal committed every crime, and the notion of punishing him, hurting him, wanting retribution will simply be a vestige, a primitive vestige. And I understand that. But and Immanuel Kant understood that also, and he called that a phenomenal explanation of life. We are phenomena. We're subject to all the laws of nature. You drop us, we fall toward the center of the earth. We can be explained chemically, biologically, etc., etc., etc. On the other hand, you are all sitting here. Well, almost all of you are still sitting here. And I don't believe that you subscribe to the fact that because of your biological predisposition and your upbringing and your education and your experience, you are drawn and driven to this spot at this moment and are incapable of being anywhere else and doing anything else. Two of you are leaving, so that proving the very point. So the point is, if we are in fact all caused to do what we do and therefore not responsible, then punishment disappears. But notice what else disappears with it. Reward disappears with it. That is, there is no justification for celebrating great achievement. How do you celebrate it? It's anyone who achieves anything great has done it as a function of his or her biological predisposition, psychological formation through early childhood, etc., etc., etc. So what Immanuel Kant said is that one of the great paradoxes of life is to accept the fact that at the same time, we are both noumenal beings and phenomenal beings. As phenomenal beings, we are subject to all the laws of nature and science, and we are caused to do what we do. As noumenal beings, we are unquestionably the authors of our own behavior and freely willing agents. Of course, there are some exceptions where we can point to there's a diminution of free will due to sets of circumstances. So basically, the answer to your question for me is that we by and large treat people as freely willing individuals at the same time that we recognize their phenomenal being. So in terms of public policy, for example, when we get the vicious criminal whom we recognize became that through child abuse, etc., etc., we do punish. But at the same time, we take our money and our resources and we pour them back into the schools in the inner city, which we keep open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, providing good meals, good counseling, open gyms, and places of refuge for these kids who are living in this horrible environment which they never chose and which is being inflicted on them. If that seems to you to be paradoxical, it is. We've understood that paradox for centuries, and Kant said that the only way to resolve the paradox between the noumenal and the phenomenal is to accept the fact that each one both requires the other and negates the other, and that if you put them together in the same plane at the same time, ultimately you are left with unresolved and irresolvable contradiction.
I can't go toe-to-toe on the genius from Königsberg, but I did want to actually answer a little bit, also make some comments about your first question. I will get to your second question for me. But it seems to me that the stereotype, and frankly, I like stereotypes, they're time savers. The stereotype is that an American drives along the street and sees a disheveled homeless person pushing a shopping cart full of old rags and says, "What's wrong with that person?" And the European drives along the street and sees a disheveled homeless person and says, "What's wrong with us?" And so I think your question gets to sort of the idea that the social environment helps to drive crime, and that this idea is still somewhat controversial in the United States. Now, I don't think Professor Blecker here is going to doubt that because he has the experience to see it, but you will see a lot of people Americans who quite strongly resist that idea and think of it as simply an excuse to condone wrongdoing. And so, but the thing is, in Europe, it is accepted by everybody of every political party that adverse social conditions play a strong role in creating crime, and that the best victory of society is to prevent a crime from happening. And that's when we have actually done the best. And so there's a lot of concern about crime prevention, about trying to target law enforcement and social resources to areas which actually need it. That also does exist in the United States, absolutely. It exists in states like Minnesota and New Jersey and New York and liberal, enlightened states that would, you would probably find very familiar as a European if you went there. But there are also states in the United States that are culturally very, very different, in which, Professor Blecker said we should focus on retribution but also improve the social conditions. And that can work. Both of those can be done at the same time. But the thing is, in many areas of the United States, that's almost like a zero-sum game, because, they're going to focus on retribution, and the focus on retribution takes away from the focus on the negative social consequences that led to crime. And the only thing that people discuss is how evil these criminals are, how horrible the crime is, and how much we should punish them. But the sort of, the Gegenstück, the counter argument or accompanying argument of how did they get there? Can we try to reduce these social conditions? Why did they start this life of criminality? I'll tell you, in states like Texas, that is almost never mentioned. It is never mentioned. And if a politician even begins to talk about the social roots of crime and adverse living conditions, they will risk their jobs, because their opponent will say, "Now you're making excuses for criminals. You think just because you didn't get the right kind of dolly when he was a child, that was okay for him to rape these people." I mean, I've seen debates among Texas politicians, and they get that crude and that simple-minded and that oversimplified. And so I think in many parts of the United States, the part where Robert Blecker lives, there is a rational and adult discussion of this. But in other parts of the states, and in fact the most important parts of the states for punishment, the states that punish much more than any other state, the most punishing state in the United States is Louisiana. It has 800 people per 100,000 behind bars. So that's like almost 1% of all people in Louisiana are in prison. In Germany, the number is 80 per 100,000. So, and Texas is number 4. Texas puts about 750 people of 100,000 behind bars. These are the highest incarceration rates, the highest imprisonment rates that have ever been measured in human history. The United States is at the very top, and Russia is the next with 500 people per 100,000 inmates. Where is China? China has 120 people per 100,000 inmates. So the US has an incarceration rate 4 times the world average. And part of it is because in the parts of the US that count, the southern states in the old Confederacy with lots of social problems, there is no dialogue about social conditions. There is no commitment to alleviating them. It is not happening. And that is also, I think, a part of this discussion, but I don't want to get too far into it. Now I'll get to your next question. The first thing that I could do, is avoid it by saying there will never be a perfect way to figure out the death penalty, so I never have to answer the question. But to be a little bit, to differentiate it, I'm definitely willing to agree that we could certainly, there will probably very soon be, in fact, there's right now technology that lets us indisputably say that somebody is guilty of a crime. So when it comes to guilt or innocence, in certain cases, DNA evidence absolutely nails it. And with a confession, there can be no doubt of their guilt. But where I'm not really where I may be misunderstanding your question is, I'm not sure we're ever going to get to an area where we're going to have that level of certainty about what is the right punishment. I just don't accept that there is an abstract case. I can't think of a case in which every human being would automatically be required to understand and accept that death is the right punishment. I can say that there's a case where every rational human must accept that the defendant is guilty, but I can't imagine a case in which every rational human must accept the defendant deserves death rather than another punishment. But even if there was some bizarre guiltotron that we developed, then I would weasel out of your question, and I would still say not to execute that person. Because part of my opposition to executing people is distrust in the mechanism, but another part is pure principle. I just don't think it should happen.
Okay, I think Andrew has taken up a bit more time than Professor Blecker.
Sorry.
So if there are any questions now directed to Professor Blecker, we could aggregate at least 2 because I think we have 2 microphones, right?
I'm sorry.
There's, okay.
Yes, it works, hopefully. Thank you very much for the thorough analysis of the proportionality between the crime and punishment. I think it's perfect, and it is something what we need. But I think you have opened 2 questions. The other one was touched in your last speeches, is the way how to improve the society, how to get rid of evil in the society. And this is the problem. Punishment, I'm afraid, is too late. My background is bioethics. I teach ethics on Charles University in Prague, and we are much more concerned about the more original phases of the human development. I think what we need is the concept of the evil self. The evil self, no self is born evil, necessarily. In this case, such self wouldn't be accountable. So we must become evil throughout our development, throughout our history. And the question is the syndrome of the evil self. We should be able to recognize it as soon as possible. And we can change it, of course. It's the Greek legacy, Western legacy, that we can teach morality, we can teach virtues. Socrates said, yes, we can teach virtues. So it's the background of the Western culture, and this is what we need and what we should do now. So we should study evil self, Breivik, Charles Manson, other wicked people, and be able to make an early diagnosis as early as possible, and to change the course of development. Of course, it is not a causal changes. It's a dialogue. Paideia, that's the heritage, paideia. So we can have a specific dialogue with these people and to change them. So I think this point is important, I think.
Before you react, let's hear another question for Robert Blecker. Is there another question for him? No microphone? Okay.
You need to pick the people, because I'm not...
Yes, so please, over here. Yes.
Professor Blecker, you said that you think the most severe kind of punishment, so the death penalty or a life sentence with no chance for parole, should only be applied if there's 100% certainty that that person's guilty, that there's no doubt whatsoever. Is
I
that
did
correct?
not say that, actually.
So you think if there's...
I mean, you are not 100% certain, nor am I, that that ceiling will not cave in on your head.
Okay, but if
you are
you
something
have
very
to be-
close to that, and you
Okay.
bravely subject your life to finishing this question, but you are not 100% certain.
Okay, so I can still ask one question. What about Troy Davis? There was a lot of doubt. There were a lot of people